I hope he is anyway. Yes, he is. I can see him in the chat. Okay, are you able to share your screen?
Yep.
Brilliant. I'll pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Max, can you let me know if that's in presentation mode? No?
It's not in presentation mode at the minute.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully we're good to go now. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for coming on to listen to my talk. Don't worry too much, Max. I should be able to catch up sometime here today. I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the work I do in around the area of executive functions in the sport, which for you guys, a more applied area, it's essentially just cognitive ability. So the way that everyday people will think and process information, and the complex tasks that we use to kind of gauge this information. Specifically, I'll go over what these are and the specific ones that we look at, because there tends to be an array of these things. So this is what we know. I'm also going to go over some of the research that I've conducted, give a very small sample of it, and this is what we think we know, I guess. And then we're going to talk about and finish with research that we're going to be interested in next, kind of the next phase of stuff that we want to look at, and that's what we don't know yet. And hopefully it'll show you kind of the more applied aspect and value of this type of work. So executive functions, as mentioned, are a set of cognitive processes that really control, regulate, and process the information that we take from the environment, and then we can use that there in our everyday behaviors. This can be from anything from reading a book. You'll use different executive functions to take in stimuli from a page, to gauging the flight of a ball and returning as serve in tennis, and then deciding an action of that. So that there's various complexities to that. And we'll talk about a very specific model that has been used quite extensively across psychology for that there. In the way that these things are kind of packaged together, they're thought to be very specific and distinct. So you'll use, for example, a very common one is inhibitory control. So that's when you go to do something, but then you stop because you realize that behavior would then lead to a less desirable or less optimal outcome. So that's called inhibitory control. Now, whilst that is in itself a very isolated type of ability, we also join that up with something like shifting ability, which relates to the idea that you must then pick another set of circumstances, another set of stimuli. And this all kind of operates on our working memory, which is referred to as updating, as we'll see in the next slide. I'll show you a summary of a study of how these things came together. In themselves, they are kind of packaged in kind of a horizontal way, considered higher and lower order. And this ranges on the complexity of them. So the very, very top of the executive function pyramid, we've got things like decision making, and then below things like problem solving and planning. And at the very lower end is those more singular, more distinct abilities, as mentioned, which are working memory, shifting, and inhibition. How these things came about, a seminal paper by Miyake looked at the interrelatedness of these via confirmatory factor analysis, which is a statistical technique that looks at the kind of underlying framework for how these things can be pieced together. And how they actually measure these tasks is through cognitive tasks. So for example, that task we talked about, inhibition, assessing the ability to stop a dominant response and then go on to another. You may have come across something like the strip task before. Strip task shows you red, blue, and green on the screen, the actual letters. And sometimes you have to pick between whether the letters are in the color that the words are in. So red is red, but sometimes the color will change from red to blue. And that's some time you have to stop from selecting a response. And these have been studied quite extensively within the area of psychology. So in the interest of keeping up with a bit of time, I'm not going to go into too much of this there. So understand these are the things that we do kind of every day in most tasks. Now, whenever we transfer this from kind of mainstream psychology more into the area of sport and exercise, there's a few specific limitations that we've tried to address in the work that we do. Those specifically is the idea of expertise. One of the things we're really interested in as a sport and exercise psychologist is do executive functions relate to better athlete performance are those with higher levels of expertise, the guys at the very, very top of their own specific games. Do they have better executive functions? And we'll not get into too much today about the chicken and egg. One, do the better sport performance improve executive function? We'll just kind of concentrate on the former. And then various meta-analyses have shown this to be the case. So we've got some empirical evidence suggesting that, yeah, these guys do tend to score better. Likewise, we know that executive functions in themselves, they also are influenced quite heavily by physical activity, which in the realm of sport and exercise is something that needs to be considered quite a bit. So a lot of research so far looking at executive functions don't often consider these things. For example, in the meta-analyses, they'll combine Olympic athletes with Premier League footballers from those high-level university leagues. So there's a lot of variance that's not appropriately controlled for. And likewise, with physical activity, there'll be a baseline improvement kind of found with that there. So again, just to be wary of those. To combat that there, we use a dichotomy proposed by Swan, Moore, and Pizzi to kind of develop a better categorization of athletic expertise. And that's the framework you can see in the top right. And then just as a quick kind of temperature check for physical activity, we also use a short form self-report physical activity questionnaire. Okay, so now on to what we think we know. The research we've done so far, just to have a quick eyeball of these, we took the reflection impulsivity task. We went for a higher order executive function in the first instance, just for convenience sakes, because a lot of these tasks are quite time consuming. So by using one simple task, we're able to do like a proof of concept study in using the Swanadol taxonomy, whilst also controlling for physical activity. So in this here, the reflection impulsivity task is essentially a decision-making task that then requires them to sometimes withhold a response, or they have to delay the response until they gather more information. Whenever we controlled for physical activity in this research, we found that, again, breaking down decision-making into its effectiveness score, but also the time component of it, so that's effectiveness and efficiency, we found that those with more expertise tended to score better on these two outcome measures. Likewise, whenever we observe this effect 16 weeks later during the playing season of various athletes, we found that, again, those who performed better had higher levels of athletic expertise. And again, that's based on the SWAN definition. In terms of the relationship with performance, in another study, again, 2 parts looking at a cross-sectional and longitudinal aspect of there, i.e. what happens during the playing season, we actually included the idea of performance in this here. So this was athletes' own self-rated performance and at the start and end of the season, and also the coaches. So we had an objective kind of measure of that as well. In the first study, using an assessment of inhibitory control of the stop signal task, which may be particularly relevant for athletes because it involves, whilst you try sometimes, you see a stimulus, you have to stop because it's no longer relevant. This also includes times where you have to go because it's more relevant. So that's quite a unique task in that respect, which may be particularly transferable to sport and exercise. In this here, you find, again, similar to the previous study, in that those with higher levels of expertise, controlling physical activity, scored better at time 1 and time 2. Again, showing the kind of the usefulness of these skills. Likewise, in the second study, this time, we were looking at the performance between stop signal task performance and both athlete and coach rated performance. There was a small positive relationship between those two. What was interesting though is when we added the athletic expertise variable in as a moderator, it enhanced the relationship. That means those who not only competed on a more recreational base, we had recreational right up to elite level athletes, those actually observed the greatest increases or more enhanced effects for that there. So that was a super interesting study that kind of shows the relevance of these things, of how they might actually work in the sports and exercise context. One of the more recent studies that we've done is actually starting to expand this out now to a more applied region. So how does executive functions interact with something like visual attention? Visual attention being those search rate. There's also a very important one called the quiet eye phenomenon. That's whenever you go to make a decision or execute a movement, where is the last place that you visualize on? And for example, like how long you visualize that for. So in a study we conducted recently with, again, some more postgrad students, we found that the relationship between executive function and performance wasn't just straight. And in fact, the inclusion of these visual attention variables mediated the relationship. That means it explains the effect. Specifically, it was just inhibition and working memory that worked in this instance, and that shifting didn't have a relationship. So I can see that Max is getting near the book. And is that 1 minute or 2 minutes? 2 minutes, awesome. Okay, I'm nearly to the end. Okay, I'm not a whistle stop tour. In this here, it was really, really interesting though, as well as the visual attention's measured by using eye tracker software. So they actually wear that, hitting their penalty as well. And this is under pressure scenarios. So again, making it a bit more relevant to the real world context. In terms of what we're going to do next, we're actually going to look at the malleability of that previous study. We're looking at whether we can train these executive functions and whether this has an enhancing effect. Research outside of sport and exercise psychology suggests that cognitive control training, which essentially involves like brain training apps that you may have seen elsewhere, involves doing daily or frequent enough practice on those tasks that then it's supposed to improve or enhance executive functions. So whilst the research isn't entirely conclusive, there is some of the suggestions that it can improve performance. In this instance, it would be for sport, but it has been resulted in less depression, and it may actually potentially have implications to offset the effects from concussion, which is really something we'd be quite keen to look at. So that is a very short whistle-stop tour of some of the research we've been doing in executive functions in terms of what we know. These are cognitive things that existed in mainstream psychology for a long time. Our research suggests that these are practical ways of investigating performance, and the future suggests it may have quite a few implications. Thank you very much for listening to this short talk, and if you have any questions, we're really happy to take those. Again, feel free to reach out to me email or Twitter, and again, the more of our publications are available on ResearchGate or institutional repository. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Rob. Is there any questions from anybody about Rob's talk? If not, I have a question. I'm really interested in this sort of stuff. What I'm wondering, is there anything that coaches can do if they were going to go away today? Is there anything they could do to embed principles around executive functioning into their practice? So is there anything that they could do, starting tomorrow, or something that could enhance executive functioning in their athletes or anything like that?
Yeah, so some of the talks we've done with the FA elite coaches is really increased in complexity. Some drills that can sometimes be a practical way. So for example, basically in the idea we talked about here, but inhibition, sometimes if you leave multiple options, so not just doing a drill straight with one outcome, sometimes throwing in different distractors can be a really easy way of making athletes think about their performance in real-time scenarios.
Perfect. And is there any other variables that it influences other than performance? So is there any other sort of performance-related variables that it has an impact on, like confidence or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think outside of sport and exercise psychology, there's shown to be those higher levels of executive function related to things like academic achievement. So again, the idea of not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but if athletes feel that their performance is better, then the confidence increases. So being able to, well, if you could, ideally, including these sorts of testing, with depending on the level, we know that some clubs and various academies like test for executive functions, their pre-season and end of season, just to see kind of what's happening there, and the results of those would be really interesting to see.